Going back to the baked noise output and baked function, before I had modified the color, I want to show you some other techniques and some cool materials you can use in different setups that will still render quickly, but allow us to get a lot more variation and make this look a lot better. So I do want to modify the terrain first. One thing I noticed is with the current setup, it is causing a couple of issues with some overlapping and some spikes really kind of jetting out. So that smaller image, I am going to change the image offset to 0.5, and then go ahead and take that max amount and bring it to 0.25 for the blender and the ratio. And now, because I do have that separate modifier, we also need to apply that change within the material. So it should look a little bit better. And I'm going to be loading in this image into view. What I did was just take that original altitude and using the same conversion as before, over to 16-bit from the 32, just really clipped out some larger areas and created some sharper cutoffs. And what I want to do is kind of mix that with the current function. So I'm just going to zoom in to the output observer. Zoom out a little bit more. Add in a texture map, and load in that optimized texture, which is my clip. Override the gamma. Set up a blender, a new blender. Blend with the grayscale. Make sure this is set to flat vertical and by cubic interpolation type. Also change the custom output to go to that blender, the new one. And I'm going to modify the size, make this much larger, so 3 by 3, and then we can multiply it by 0.2. Looks like there might be a few spiky areas, so we can offset it by 0.5 and 0.25. It does look a little better. So now we have a little more variation in the height, so we can raise it up. What I also want to do is go to the material, and under the effects tab, take the contrast and bring it down to 2, which is really going to bring out more detail instead of sharply cutting everything off. So we can take a look at a render for that. So we have some pretty nice details showing up. And we're going to make some more modifications, starting with the bump. First thing I want to do is set it to a negative 0.4. And now we're going to mix this together with a fractal node. And the fractal that we're going to use, we're going to go ahead and add in a fractal node, change it over to a basic repeater, which is more minimized fractal. It's closer to a noise node in its detail, depending on how you mix it together, but it gives us a good shape overall. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in so I can see our texture a little bit better. And just go ahead and set a few things up. We're going to change the noise over to distributed patterns, square samples, and we need to get our scale to match better. Because we are in a parametric mode, we're going to need a much smaller scale. So I'm going to set the wavelength to 0.04 and then 0.05 and leave the Z at 1 to fit in to our area. And then, and we really can't see it showing up yet because we don't have it connected. So I'll start just by connecting it, adding in a blender, setting it to subtract. And we're going to subtract around, say 0.1, connect that to the altitude. We need to make a few changes. This is obviously way too busy. So we're going to go, and what I want to do is set the repeat amount in the harmonic behavior to 2, and then and we'll change the combination mode to max. And now we're going to go into select edit, and we can modify the parameters of the noise. So we're going to go in here, and I want the scale to be below 0.5. That way I can create some panels with some seams. So I'm going to use 0.48. Randomness I want at 0. I don't want them random at all. Scale variations we'll go ahead and set to 0.1. So very, very tiny amount of overlapping. The shape we're going to use the cube. And samples 0 to 2. So we're going to get some nice panels overall with this. And we're also going to turn on the fine maximums. And that should be good for the bump setup. If we need to reduce the intensity, we can go to that blender and set the subtract to 0.01 because before it might have been too intense. We can go ahead and we can take a look at those panels. And the mix I'm using for the terrain, adding that modifier or that new image, it is just making everything way too wavy. The panels look good though, or that new bump that is showing. So what I'm going to do is go into that function and change this from multiply to add. So now we can just add in this other image. And we should get a little more variation, and without the waviness, we'll go ahead and reduce the height. And that should look a little bit better. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in on an area a little more where we can see the panels better in order to make modifications appropriately. So I'm just running into a little bit of a jagged edge problem, which we can see showing on the edges. So I am going to make another modification just to get rid of that. And we can really end up seeing that once we look in here. So we'll just set the blending amount to be a little bit lower. We can also go into that secondary image and go to map. Connect that, and we want to change the output a little. So we should be able to reduce this and hopefully get rid of those really jagged areas. It looks like that might do it. It doesn't look like that really took care of it. Could be the other function or the other image causing that problem. We'll go ahead and take a look before just moving on. Just make sure our interpolation types are set correctly. And we can modify our max value go ahead and set the max ratio to 0.1 and modify this map. And that might cut it out completely. We'll just take a look and see. We should have most of that detail in there. If not, we'll just focus on the panels right now and worry about tweaking that later. So we'll go ahead and zoom in here. And what I'm going to modify next is the color to match with the panels better. So we're going to end up creating a duplicate. We're also going to create some more interesting effects using that panel as well. So we can see the scale variations of the panel in that square sample every once in a while overlapping, creating some divisions or creating some larger paneled areas. You can modify this in a lot of different ways to get different results. But what I want to do right now is modify just the color slightly, and I'm not even going to worry about using a color map. What I'm going to end up doing is using a color correction. So we can add in a color map, and we're going to switch this over to color correction brightness. Connect this to our chain for the color. And then, because I want to create a slightly different output than this basic repeater, with that selected, I'm going to click over to the side over here and add in a fractal, which is going to duplicate those settings, and we're going to connect that to the brightness output for the altitude. Now this is going to be really extreme. Brightness is very touchy, so we do need to reduce the output of this. First I'm going to make a couple of changes. Go to Edit, and I'm going to reduce the size just a little bit, 0.473 for the size, and then the scale variation 0.05. Set random altitudes, and that'll give us a lot more variation. And now we need to basically clip this so that we're only slightly modifying the brightness. So we'll add in a filter. We're going to use the map and take a look at that output. And it looks like maybe -3 to 1 for our input. -0.3, I should say, to 1. And then our output range 0.1 and -0.1. It's a very, very minimal change. We don't want a huge amount of brightness change, just enough to modify some of the panel's color. And that looks pretty good. We'll go ahead and take a look at that from far away. So this is that close-up, and then we'll take a look farther away. So overall, it does look really good. I would like to bring back that smaller detail from the other texture map. So it is going to be a matter of just kind of tweaking that until I get it to a point where I'm not going to have so many jagged edges, and I might have to just change the offset a little or modify scale. or just pick an area to render where there aren't many spiky areas. Before I do that, I want to continue modifying the material. And what we're going to do is create another connection in a blend with the basic repeater. Select that fractal, add it in again, and go to Edit and change the shape over to, let's go ahead and use a round pyramid, should work. Add in, we're going to do this before the map, and we can just modify it. Add in a blender, connect that to the basic repeater. Set this to subtract, and we will have to zoom in quite a bit so we can see the change. I just want to be able to see that output. Not really showing up much at the moment. And we might need to invert it. I'm going to, for the moment, take this map and set it to a higher value. Let's do 0.2, negative 0.2, so we can start to see the area showing up. And I'm somewhat getting what I want, it looks like, but I do need to make a modification. Or I may just need to switch this around. And it looks like I'm going to have to use a different filter. So what I'm going to do is add a filter. We're going to select opposite. And go back to subtract and see how that looks. We may need to offset it. Add a filter, set it to offset, reducing it. And I'm going to go back to the noise, turn off the fine maximums, turn off random altitudes, just to see which one's going to work better. Because the blend overall is just not reducing the way I can normally get it to. We'll go back, set that value. So what I've done is gone to the noise, set the shape to round pyramid, random altitudes turned on. I've got the offset to round negative 0.35, and just round it off. The blender subtract at 0.25. In the map, we'll need to set the max value to, or the upper value to 0, and that negative I'm going to set to negative 0.2. Maybe we can use negative 0.3. That might be a little too high. So let's do negative 0.25. And there's one last thing I want to do is go back to that basic repeater, hit edit, and change the size to 0.46. So reducing it a little bit more. We'll go ahead and take a look. So it doesn't seem like a huge change, but it does have a nice small dip in it, a little bit of variation. Like I said, not huge, but enough to create a little more interesting of a look. I'm going to go ahead and zoom out and add in one more layer. Just hit the X, close that out. What we do is go to the Effects tab, take the diffusion, set it to 20, take the ambient, set it to 10. It's going to be pretty dark, so we want to set the alpha boost negative 50. It's going to blend in. Actually, maybe we'll do negative 35. And we're going to limit this to the bottom of the altitude. So reduce the altitude negative 0.9, and then change the fuzziness to, say, 3.5%. Maybe do an alpha boost -20. And I do need to modify the bump, actually, so I am going to cancel this render. Go to that bump channel, set the depth to 0, and make sure it's adding, and that way we don't remove any of the bump from the layer below it. So now we've got some darker areas along the lowest point of the altitude, and it starts to fade or really disperse, more of a gradient as it reaches upward, but very minimal right now. So what I can do is increase that fuzziness option in order to spread that out. What I'm doing is not only modifying the overall look of it based on the altitude, but I also want to kind of fake or add a bit more to that ambient occlusion that I currently have. So this will increase the look of that and darken it up a bit more. We'll take the fuzziness and let's take a look at setting it to 10 and see how that will impact it. Sometimes that might be a little bit too much, really depending on the height, because it could end up being sort of a center level. Whereas we increase the fuzziness, the total altitude range will sort of go in the middle, in the median. It doesn't look too bad. Also keeping in mind, this is set by material, so since our height isn't extremely high, a low value isn't going to give us a huge impact. Let's go ahead and set this to -0.85 to increase the range, and set the fuzziness for the top to 25. Modifying the bottom will remove from that lower portion, which I don't want to do. This looks much better now. We'll let that finish up. So that looks pretty nice. Now, the render time is going up. About a 41-second render. It says 41 seconds. That's slower than it was before, which was, I believe, 24. So about doubled it again. But the quality boost is also turned up all the way in order to get the best look for the terrain. So it will take a little bit longer, but obviously much quicker than rendering the original noises. So now what I'm going to do with this is modify the color a little bit. Going into that material, select color. Oh, wrong one. We're on the, let's just say, we'll just call it AO. And make this our base layer. Go into the color production, and we're going to add another color correction. Add that in. It's just going to duplicate and give us a brightness. We're going to change this over to the HLS shift. What this will allow us to do is adjust the hue, luminosity, and saturation using a numeric value, which means we can tie it into our different functions we have. I'm going to use the external dependency from the altitude and that mix in order to control the hue. And we are going to need to limit the output because it's going to give us some very extreme values. It's very sensitive output because it's the full range of color. If you do have Snowflake, I created a node that is the HLS shift intensity range. What this does is reduces, it's basically the same thing, except it reduces the overall input amount so that it's not so intense. And that way you can adjust the sensitivity. So it has a sensitivity built into it, which is pretty nice. But in case you don't have the ability to adjust that range, because I could plug that in and knock that down to 0.1 and it would hardly modify the color, which is what I want. But in case you don't have that, what you can do is just the map filter. Again, it's a really great limiter. I use it all the time, quite frequently. So we'll just go ahead and set the upper value and lower value to a very minimal amount, depending on which direction we want the color to go. So let's do a negative 0.01 for the subtraction, which is a tiny bit towards red, and then maybe not 0.2, 0.11, or type that in, and we can get more of a green color for that shift. We could also set up a brightness shift, so the luminosity shift. That would be basically the same as using the brightness, except it's a lot more sensitive, and will max out color more, and in some cases will react better with HDRI. It really depends. Saturation we could also shift. So let's go ahead and adjust the saturation using that connection to the map from the panels at a map node. So we can make it more gray by making a much lower output range for the lower value, or increasing the saturation going the other direction. This will just give us a slight little color change. It shouldn't be anything overly dramatic, but it does look nice. I can see right now already showing up. So let it finish. That looks pretty good overall. So obviously there's more we can do with this material-wise, but I want to show you some additional options we could do with terrains that's really cool. First, what I'm going to do is probably get some more detail out of this and make it look a little bit better. And then we'll take a look at some cool stuff we can do by using even just these images to add a lot more depth to the terrain. Because one thing we don't have, everything's just vertically being displaced. There's nothing coming out the edges. So we'll take a look at some techniques for that. So I was able to make some quick changes to the terrain to pull out some of the detail from that smaller overlaying texture. And what I did was adjust the map so that the range was 0.1, set an offset, negative 0.45614, so you could use negative 0.45, and my max for the blender is set to 0.2, so it was just enough to start pulling out the details, which we can see showing up as these more flatter areas. And I just want to take a look at the difference between adding in this larger function. It looks like maybe 3 might be too much, so maybe we'll set that up to 2. Or just remove the offset. And do negative 0.1. Just add a little bit more. And that, I like the way that looks. A lot more variation. We'll have to see if we need to adjust that ambient occlusion layer because the overall scale of the object is changing. We can also see that as impacting the way the hue shift is going because the output range is becoming much higher. So we're seeing a much larger shift in the hue and the color change and some of the different options. So maybe I will go back just so I don't have to remodify everything. Add 0.5. Let's go to 0.4. And that should be okay. I liked the finer details anyway. I wanted something kind of dense to begin with. And I think I can accept that. It looks alright. So let's go ahead and continue. And I'm going to show you another technique. First I'm going to save this out. And one cool thing we can do with this setup is just copy and paste to create a duplicate. And we want to make sure that the material is going to be different, so I'm going to edit the material on there. And any dependency we need to go to and modify it so that it is the duplicate dependency, so that if we change anything it's going to match up correctly. Now we can choose to use this current setup if we wanted, or we can modify it. But what I want to do is add a little more elevation, or some different areas, sort of pathways throughout. And what I'm going to do is just go down to the bottom to the altitude and clip it out on the minimum. We can zoom in if needed. Increase the resolution so that we can see the way things are being cut a little bit better. Keep in mind that this is going to be an exact match for the current terrain. So we may need to modify our size, whether shrinking it or increasing it in scale. Also going in, maybe we could switch around the textures a bit. But just cutting this out and adding it sort of as an intersection. And if we need to clip it more, we can. So that just maybe some of the finer details are showing. One thing I'm going to do is go to that material, select the base, edit the function, and I want to lighten this a little. So what we can do is take the connection to our brightness and take the upper value and set it to 0.1, lower value negative 0.15. So just a little bit brighter. We could modify the hue and that change if we wanted to do towards a different color. We could do that. Negative 0.15. Let's do 0.176. Doesn't look like there's much information in there, but it's really a tiny amount. That's all it really takes. The bump influence for the tiles, we could increase for this thin layer. So 0.025 for that blender going between the basic repeater and the external dependency. And that should give us a nice little change to start with. We can also reduce our height, and that'll help blend it in a little bit more. And you can start to see the intersections and the overlapping. It looks like there's a lot of edges that are just being just ripped out of there. So probably need to make some changes to modify that. One thing I want to do is just darken it up a bit by taking the alpha boost of that AO or faked AO layer, setting it to a negative 30. I also want to make sure that the panels aren't identical to the other ones. I mean, they shouldn't be because we just changed the scale, but just to be on the safe side. And this is also something that needs to be done for all of these square samples. So what I can do is add in math node vector operation offset and just connect all of the vectors to that offset and the offset to the position, and then just make a couple of changes. And that way, even if it was scaled to the same size, it will be different enough so I'm also going to go to our atmosphere in the atmosphere editor and just turn that up a little towards sunlight so we can see some of those shadows, because that's really going to pull out a lot of depth now that we have basically another layer kind of hovering over the other one. And there's more we're going to be doing with it to make it look better. We'll just let this finish up here, and we can take a look at the render. So it does have a bit more dimension to it now. Slowly getting more and more complex. And every time, of course, I copy and paste and create a new duplicate, it is going to increase the render time, but not nearly as much as it would have before if these were still the original procedural terrains. And I could also go back and create some new functions or new nodes to render out, or start setting up some different material maps. One thing that's taking slightly longer to render is that square samples. That is a pretty intensive fractal or noise pattern. There's quite a bit to it. So if needed, you could create a texture map to match that. The only thing is getting the vertical detail to look correct. That can be a little difficult depending on how it is you want to set it up and how much variation you want throughout. I like to have a lot of variation, so these fractals are fantastic for huge amounts of variation because they don't really repeat themselves in the way that a texture would, because there's always going to be that tiling effect. Now, because we don't have the original procedural, there's a few things we can't do that are some cool effects. In the way that we were modifying the size of the noises before, we could kind of step that up with these cutout terrains and stack them, raise them up a little higher in order to create some beveled edges almost, or outer offsets. And we really need to modify the image a lot more using a combination of blurs and contrast settings, and really creating a huge modification in order to get that sort of an effect from the images. I'm going to go ahead and pull this out a little bit. I'm also going to copy and paste it once again and just shift it up a little, edit the object, go ahead and zoom in, and we can start to clip from the top as long as we can get a nice even clip. It is going to create a fairly smooth surface, but with the texture that's on it, should be okay. So we can get some thinner details to kind of float in there. Modify the scale. We can shift it. And we could set different levels of elevation. We could have this one up a little higher. Really depends on just how you want to modify it. It's just kind of a cool way to increase the depth. And it was difficult to see before, but it looks like there's just it's getting a little too flat at this point. So what I want to do is modify the scales of those additional layers and size them down in order to get them to fit better. Mainly this new procedural that ended up being way too large, creating too many gaps. Because we still like to see the bottom, or I'd like to see the bottom. Go ahead and take a look at that. So that's looking much better now. I'm pretty happy with that. I think maybe the original layer might need to be slightly modified. For the most part, I think it looks pretty cool. Render time has increased to 2 minutes a frame now, so it is obviously going up more and more every time this is copied over, because we have those functions and that fractal within the material that is needing to be rendered, and in this case smaller and smaller. And of course the quality boost on the terrains is set up to 4. So I'm going to reduce the quality boost on all of the terrains just for now, so that things move along a little bit quicker. And we can continue something that's going to show up a little bit quicker. It'll be a little bit easier to manage as well. All of these terrains are also very small at this point, so I'm going to select all of them, switch over to the size gizmo, and really scale all that up. Since we have a parametric scaling mode, we don't need to worry about modifying the materials. There's no world modes being used in this setup. I also want to note that one thing you can use that can be pretty cool if it is working correctly, sometimes it causes issues, is terrains, both procedural and standard, have the ability to use a symmetrical. So if you go up to the top, you can select symmetrical, and it will mirror the geometry down to the bottom. Now the preview is off right now. The render may also be off. It's really going to depend. In some situations it works great. Sometimes you're just always going to run into a problem with it and never be able to get it to work. It works great with standard terrains. It's just procedural terrains that kind of have a problem because of the way the elevation will go beyond pivot points. And anytime you've turned on that symmetrical terrain and then made a change to the terrain, the procedural, or sometimes even just changing the size, it will throw off the way the symmetry is. So we'll see if that's even worth having on. If not, we'll just turn it off, because we're only looking at stuff from up on top right now anyway. It does look like it is having some issues. And some parts look like they're showing up correctly, and some parts don't. I'll just go ahead and leave it on for now. I'm also going to go into the original terrain and squish it down on the y-axis, modifying the scale, because our detail amount is just not as good as it is on the smaller terrains in those intersecting areas. So that way we can improve some of the detail a little. And I'll go ahead and save this out, and then you can continue to add that loom layer back on for the slope on certain areas, and then take a look at how we can adjust some lighting settings to really get this to stand out really well.